Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Reveresco. We shall rise again. Such was the motto given by Robert the Bruce to my family, the Maxwells of Carlaverock Castle. My family left Scotland after being forced out for financing one too many uprisings. The last one being the Jacobite uprising. Nevertheless, let's not dwell on ancient history. On the 18th of September, the Scots have the chance to vote for independence, to rise again. The media in the UK is universally against independence, including George Galloway, right here on this network. So we're going to take a look at some of the issues that matter to the other side, Stacey.
Max, first of all, I want to say this episode was basically inspired by Tommy Sheridan, Citizen Tommy on Twitter. He and all his followers have been tweeting me nonstop for the last 6 to 8 weeks, saying you have to get him on, you have to get him on. We got him on. And lo and behold, he is at the last minute unable to attend the interview because of some marquee, which is this posh tent, some problem with the posh tent.
I think he just got cold feet, which that doesn't speak well for this movement.
Well, and another full disclosure, my family is Scottish and they all very pro-independence. So with that, however, one of the issues that those who want independence from Scotland is the opposite of what George Galloway says. So George Galloway says that the reason why he's against independence is that basically England will be condemned to a future forever ruled by Tories, because it's only with a Scottish vote that basically the Tories don't control everything. Now, I saw Alan Cumming, the Scottish actor, on Bloomberg television pro-independence, and he said, we in Scotland have never, ever had a government that represents how we vote. So they're basically condemned to either the Tories or the neoliberal New Labour. So I thought that was interesting. I hadn't ever seen it put that way, and it really inspired me to look at the policies here in England right now that they are against and what they don't want for Scotland. Royal Mail float scandal, how hedge funds cleaned up. The Royal Mail flotation scandal has deepened after officials finally admitted that hedge funds were among the priority investors sold hundreds of millions of pounds of shares. The business secretary, Vince Cable, has repeatedly insisted that the handful of key investors offered Royal Mail shares on preferential terms were long-term institutional investors. This was to ensure that the new company started with a core of high-quality investors who would be there in good times and bad. He promised to marginalize spivs and speculators.
Can I comment on Scottish independence?
Sure.
I've got a frickin' castle up there. The Maxwell clan is embedded in the history of Scotland. And of course, we would want independence. And I don't understand Galloway's position at all. Because why would we? The point of being independent is that we don't give a flying fig what England is doing, or what the UK is doing. So what that the UK government would be forever Tory? It already is forever Tory. It's just Tony Blair is a Tory. New Labour was Tory. It's all Tory. That's what the point of being independent is, to get away from these frickin', warmongering idiots. Now, as far as the economy goes, we'll take all the oil. You keep all the debt of Royal Bank of Scotland. We'll create Scot coin, our own currency. It'll be a cryptocurrency. You can keep the British pound. Okay? As some have speculated, Dominic Frisby on this very show, given the size of Scotland and its economic potential, it could have the highest capita per GDP in the world, higher than even Qatar. So we're rich if we get rid of these Westminster losers. Now, moving right along to the point that you just made about
the Royal Mail. It turns
the Royal
out
Mail.
that those 19 core investors that we were told were long-term institutional investors, well, in fact, many of them were hedge funds who sold immediately with a huge profit at the expense of the British taxpayer, which includes Scottish people and their oil, by the way. And they sold it immediately within 48 hours, a lot of them.
Wall Street in the City of London saw Vince Cable coming a mile away. This guy had his pocket picked so horribly, you almost feel sorry for the guy. But Royal Mail was a travesty. The amount of money that they left on the table in the billions of pounds is shocking. And Vince Cable is a business idiot. He's a nincompoop. For him to come out there on television and say with a straight face that they had no idea that the market was oversubscribing this offer, even though the banks that they consulted with to give them a fair IPO price gave them an IPO price that was 50% higher than the price that they went out to the market. The fact that they allowed insiders and hedge funds to scalp the market and dump the market, and shamelessly as they did, shows a complete lack of respect for the British people, Vince Cable. You have shown contempt for the British people. It's not even about being incompetent. It's about being contemptuous of your constituency and your fellow British people. And there's no way in frickin', I mean, I used to work on Wall Street myself, and I've been involved in dozens and dozens of IPOs, and I know how the game works. And I can tell you point blank that Vince Cable got shafted, and so did the British people.
You're going a little bit ahead because I'm going to go into those details in a bit. But I want to remind the audience, because many people are watching around the world, they don't know who or what we're talking about, perhaps. The Royal Mail is a 498-year-old institution here in the United Kingdom. It was privatized, sold off. Now, as Vince Cable has rightly pointed out, New Labour, Peter Mandelson, and Tony Blair also wanted to privatize it. So that's part of their defense, is they're saying, well, the previous government also wanted to do this. The shares were launched, the IPO, at 330p. They jumped by 38% that day. Now, 20% of the shares were allocated to 16 preferred investors, had gone to hedge funds and other short-term investors. The information that has since emerged have proven. This would equate to around 150 million pounds of Royal Mail shares, 13% of the entire stock floated by the government. Now, Vince Cable argued at the time, and he argued just recently. Actually, let's look at this clip from Question Time on the 3rd of April, where he said that it was you, the pension holders out there, who benefited.
If we'd allocated it all to the very wealthy investors, then small investors would not have had anything.
But the very wealthy investors were the 16 big investors.
They're not wealthy private investors.
They're much wealthier now than they were when they bought the shares.
Let me just describe who they were.
A lot of them are hedge funds.
We're talking about the Legal and General, which has hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of members. We're talking about Royal London. We're talking about classic insurance companies. We're talking about local authority pension funds. Several of them, actually Labour councils in some case, invested their funds in the Royal Mail. These are these wicked financial institutions.
What about the hedge funds?
Well, there are very few hedge funds represented. The one that did buy in has actually disappeared. There's very little hedge fund activity. Most of these are long-term pension funds.
When you say disappeared, you mean cut and run?
They did, yes, actually.
Yeah.
The people we wanted to sell to were the serious long-term investors who have the Royal Mail's interest at heart. And they're still there. I mean, there is still a substantial majority of shares held by companies of that kind.
Yeah, well, like I said, this was extremely... there are provisions on an IPO of this nature for clawbacks in the case of a situation where there is a massive mispricing. I mean, he refers to the Facebook IPO as an example of one that had problems getting through, and therefore there was a risk involved. Of course, the Facebook shareholders that got scammed by that sued and won, and they were able to claw back. And so were the exchanges. So where's the clawback for the people who got ripped off shamelessly on this IPO, number one? Number two, this is a public institution owned by the British people. It's not just some high-tech whiz-bang, 3 or 4 or 5-year-old enterprise. This is almost a 500-year-old enterprise. This is income-producing assets that are not going to go into the pension funds of Germans and Americans, and people around the world are going to be benefiting from the income stream from the Royal Mail, not the British public. The British public isn't going to benefit at all from this. They have outsourced all that income to foreign countries. They get no benefit from this whatsoever.
Yeah, but also the market said they underpriced it. So that was by well over £1 billion that the taxpayer was defrauded, that they had looted from them, that they lost that. And he's pushing this notion that, well, your pension funds, long-term institutional investors own it. Well, who has pension funds anymore? But only the people who have already benefited from Margaret Thatcher's Help to Buy scheme when she first let out the public housing here for speculators to buy and own and speculate on and profit from. So it's only those sort of people, the 50-year-olds, the people with jobs, who have pensions. A lot of people in this very unequal society do not have pensions, so their pension funds will not hold any of these profits gained by fleecing the other taxpayers.
Now they're looking back and saying we had no idea this was going to happen, that the market is unpredictable. But the market is completely unpredictable when you're manipulating the market in this shameless manner. And, Vince Cable, I just don't see how he can possibly, he should resign. He should throw himself on the sword. I mean, he says that he's saying by example that I had no idea, because the previous Labour government did something, I'm going to do it. I mean, there's a lot of bankers committing suicide now. By that logic, should Vince Cable throw himself off a building? Does he have no mature adult ability to think for himself? Does he only just mimic something that came before him? I mean, take that big fat nursemaid tit out of your mouth that you're getting free from the state and the people and use your brain. You're a shameless, opportunistic idiot for these hedge funds, and you should be so embarrassed to just leave government, leave the country, get out of town. You're a shambolic idiot.
Okay, so let's go back to that question time thing, because the audience also were basically backing Vince Cable, this notion that he couldn't have possibly known. Nobody possibly understood what the share price would be. Here's some of the audience response.
What do you make of it? Anthony Ward, you asked the question. What's your view of it?
I think it's very easy to be wise after the event.
Absolutely. Yes,
It's, it's notoriously difficult to predict the future values and the price that people will pay for shares. I think it was important to have a successful sale.
It really annoys me when you try to make political capital out of these kind of issues. It really does. But in terms of
who's making political capital?
Peter Hain.
Oh.
You know, he's coming out with huge hindsight.
Sure.
And you know, where were the arguments at the time?
Again, it's totally shameless. In an era where LIBOR is manipulated, Forex manipulated, gold markets manipulated, house markets manipulated, every single aspect of this economy is manipulated and known ahead of time. High-frequency trading scandal, totally manipulated, known ahead of time of the price going forward. There's one issue on one day where Vince Cable says, I had no idea what the price was going to be. Let me say, without equivocation, he's lying. He's lying.
Okay, so let's go and actually look at the people that they chose to sell shares, what those people were saying. Not only Lazard, we're going to go back to them in the second half. So we're going to look at RBC Bank and we're going to look at Barclays and what they were telling clients. They were handling shares for the government. They were selling shares to investors. One of the members of the banking syndicate was RBC. Their equity analyst colleagues advised many of the same clients that Royal Mail shares were worth a far higher price, up to a 55% premium on its 330p float price. So that's what RBC were telling their clients. Now let's look at Barclays, owned by the taxpayer, by the way. Barclays analysts described Royal Mail as cash generative, benefiting from reduced regulatory constraints and a much improved balance sheet, thanks in large part to the taxpayer picking up the bulk of the Royal Mail's pension liability. So Barclays said because the taxpayer slump is picking up the pension liabilities, the share price will jump, they said, 27%, at least over what the float price was.
You know what really disgusts me about all this is not only did the Cable's office essentially misrepresent the situation, but they blamed an industrial action, the workers at Royal Mail who were out on strike, as reason why there was uncertainty about the value of these shares. So once again, showing contempt for the people. It would be like saying to Vince Cable, okay, we want you to take that hill to save Britain from an invading army. And Vince Cable says, but I've got a hangnail. I can't go over the hill. There's an industrial action. Somebody has a placard in the street. So I'm going to pee away £1 billion. This guy, he makes Cameron look almost acceptable. I mean, he's the biggest. I mean, what a jack. Fill in the rest of the. Oh my God, what an idiot. Okay, we got to go, Stacey. Thanks.
I'll see you in the second half.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Now I'd like to turn to a special guest, Stacey Herbert. Stacey, thanks for coming on the Keiser Report. That's a fetching outfit you have on, darling.
Thank you. And we're talking about Scottish independence, and we're looking at the English situation and how they keep on privatizing and looting the nation and looting the taxpayers. And this is part of the core of those who want Scottish independence. This is what they claim, that they're against this sort of thing and they don't want it in Scotland. They still have free education, for example, unlike the top-up fees here. They don't want a privatized healthcare system like they're seeking here. So these are some of the issues. These are what I'm looking at. And we're looking at the Royal Mail. We're going to pick up from the first half where we were talking about that. Now, Vince Cable, the business secretary here, had claims that they were institutional investors, long-term holders of Royal Mail that were benefiting from the flotation of the shares at 330p. They're now at 600p, or went up to 600p. But a recent National Audit Office report revealed that 16 of those priority investors, well, they actually sold all of their shares within weeks of the flotation. One of those is Lazard. Lazard Bank was the lead advisor to the business secretary, Vince Cable, and the coalition government about this privatization of the Royal Mail. Remember, a 498-year-old public institution up until just a few months ago. Lazard advised on Royal Mail shares, then profited by £8 million in flotation. The investment bank that advised the government not to increase the price of Royal Mail shares, despite widespread fears that they were massively undervalued, made a profit of more than £8 million by immediately selling the company's stock in the wake of its controversial privatization. So Lazard was paid £1.5 million by the government to advise them on what to price the shares at. Despite others like JP Morgan was actually close to what the shares did eventually hit that day. They said, no, that would be overvaluing it. It might be like Facebook, it might be a flop, it might be a disaster. Well, they themselves made £8.4 million on flipping shares that day.
In this case, Lazard Frères is acting with impropriety because if you remember Frank Quattroni back in the dot-com phase of Credit Suisse, he was involved in what's called laddering on IPOs. There's a lot of ways to game IPOs. One of the ways to game IPOs, it would be apparent in this a situation, my observation of Lazard would be that they are gaming this in a lot of ways. Now, the point of the investment bank doing the deal is to support the deal in the aftermarket. They have what's called a green shoe, which is they've got stock and inventory. In case the people are dumping stock, then the bank can buy stock in the open market to support the IPO price. But here's the complete opposite. The price skyrocketed because they purposely mispriced it. Then they dumped their inventory to make a quick profit like that. On top of the fee. You see, you pay a firm like Lazard a fee so that they don't ruin the IPO, as apparently they have. So their fee should be stripped. At the very minimum, at the very least, Vince should be on the phone right now with Lazard saying, give us back our fee or we're going to lose your license to operate in the UK. No questions asked. The fact that he doesn't is plain and simply proof positive that he's conflicted, that he's venal, and he should be thrown out of this country.
Are you trying to get payback for when your family was thrown out back in the 1715 period?
It was schmadas like Vince Cable that's destroyed the Maxwell uprising. We're going to rectify that situation in independence, with or without Tommy Sheridan.
So the Royal Mail share flotation was 23 times oversubscribed. That alone should have told them that this was undervalued. This is like going to one of those, the August sales or the January sales where there's tens of thousands of people waiting outside all the major the department stores here. You know that there's a big discount going on. That's why people are lined up. People want 50% off what they think is worth.
Right, it's as if Vince Cable went to Soho and he went to that restaurant called The Breakfast Club, which has a line going around the block to get cheap pancakes. And he looked at that and said, I don't know if they're going to sell a single pancake today. I don't know. I can't tell. There's a line around the block to buy these pancakes, but I'm Vince Cable. I don't know. I can't tell. I've had my brains removed. You mean there's a line around the block? Nah, that'll never work. It's 23 times oversubscribed? Who would want a freaking share of the Royal Mail? We gotta just give Lazard £8 million for nothing. We're gonna let him take a fee. We're going to give George Osborne's buddy from his little Oxfam college that he went to learn how to rip people off, or Oxbridge. We're going to give him a few £1 million as well. Oxbridge, Oxfam.
So another guy in Vince Cable's department, he's a business minister named Michael Fallon. He said in front of a committee in Parliament, he said, it was a successful flotation. I have not seen any evidence that the shares were undervalued at the time of the flotation. I stick by the share price. He's seen no evidence, despite even the 38% rise in the price of the shares. That means it was underpriced. That's what is the price signal but a price signal?
There's something called the FT. It has all the prices. If you're not reading it, I don't know how to help you.
Okay. Well, let's look back to the fact that we talked about Lazard was paid £1.5 million. Then they made £8.4 million on flipping shares those first 24, 48 hours. Now, the Public Accounts Committee is looking into this. The PAC will examine what advice was given by investment banks, including Goldman Sachs, UBS, and Lazard, and why the shares were priced so cheaply. It will also demand to know why Lazard has been appointed to run the vast majority of major privatizations under the current government following previous revelations by the Independent. So, this government that just had this disaster of the Royal Mail, a 498-year-old public institution, they're appointing the same advisors to handle all of their upcoming privatizations.
I just don't understand it. They made £8 million gaming the system on top of the 1-point-something million pounds in the fees. I don't understand why at the very minimum cable and this government can't say either give us the £8 million you stole or the $1.5 million fee. You know, those are your two choices. No, instead they're going to say, you did such a good job financially raping our country that we're going to give you some more business. Here's another privatization. Here's another income-producing asset, the NHS, which doesn't need to go private at all. But we're going to do it anyway because you, Lazard, pull our strings because here's Vince Cable, the puppet. I think the Lazard Fair should get all the money because I'm brain dead. I'm a puppet for Lazard. There's George Osborne and Dave Cameron. Oh, Lazard Fair, please give me $10 so I can buy some more votes, and I'll let you give you £1 billion from people out there. I'll give it in your pocket because I'm a corrupt, morally depraved. I'm thinking of a word that rhymes with Jeremy Hunt, but I can't say it on this program.
So Lazard, by the way, is considered by many to be one of the most, if not the most powerful bank in the world. It's a bit behind the scenes. Most people look at JP Morgan because of the size of their derivatives book and stuff, but these guys are like the little puppet
I know
masters.
Lazard Fair. I've known him for years. You know, I worked with him on Wall Street. But the thing about the crisis of 2008 is that it was supposed to, the problem was, remember, too big to fail. So as a result, several banks went out of business, like Bear Stearns, like Lehman Brothers, and now you've got the remaining shysters like Lazard Frere are bigger than ever. It's too big to fail, become too big to fail, much more pronounced, much more of a problem. Too bigger to fail. So there's Lazard, basically an oligopolis, an oligarchy. Meanwhile, the UK government's saying we got to stop these oligarchs in various countries around the world. We send good British soldiers out there to die because we're going to protect good things here in Britain. And they're letting an oligarch, Lazard Frere, pull their strings like stupid little puppets. He looks like, when Cameron talks, you can see the puppet strings at the House of Commons. You can see them. He walks and talks. He's the most shamelessly puppet nightmare. He's worse than Thatcher. He's worse than Thatcher.
Okay, give Max back his castle and he'll shut up,
Yeah,
okay?
give me my freaking castle and we'll call it even.
And then finally, here's another reason why the Scots don't want to be like the people south of the border there. 0 hours contracts trapping 1.4 million workers at the whim of their boss. Nearly half of Britain's biggest businesses are using 0 hour contracts to employ 1.4 million workers across the country, official figures show. The contracts mean there's no obligation on the employer to provide regular shifts or for the employee to work a certain number of hours. By the way, Friedrich Hayek is the economist upon which Margaret Thatcher based a lot of her concepts on. However, it's selective fundamentalist reading of his text because he was actually for guaranteed basic income because of exactly this. He thought a man cannot be free if he was always at the whim and the mercy of his boss.
Right, either minimum wage or basic income are the people's central bank. And let me explain what I mean. If you're going to have a system like in the UK where the Bank of England is printing money and it goes into the pockets of oligarchs like Lazard Frere, then if the people have no recourse, if they have no outlet economically to express their own interests, then you just have a slave state like Saudi Arabia. So the only way that people in the UK can fight back against the central bank, the Bank of England, and kleptocrats like Lazard Frere is by wanting higher minimum wage or a basic income structure. That's their recourse. That's the debate. If you don't want minimum wage and you want real free market, get rid of the central bank. But you can't have a central bank which is pilfering on behalf of oligarchs and have no minimum wage. That's beyond cruel. That's setting yourself up for a collapsed state, and you see it right here in the UK. People are waking up to the fact that they are being exploited horribly.
that's our episode about Scottish independence. If you want to see the other side, look at the BBC, look at any of the media here in the UK. It's all against independence. Read any of George Osborne or David Cameron's speeches. They're against independence for Scotland. So that's the other side of the
They
equation.
were against American independence.
Exactly.
Okay, so we said, to hell with you, we're going to declare our independence. Okay, now we run Britain. Who do you think is the puppet behind the puppet? Who do you think is the puppet behind the Lazard Frere and David Cameron? Don't you think it's J.P. Nyman, Goldman Sachs? They're the master puppets because they declared their independence. Scotland, as an independent state, could have the highest GDP per capita in the world. They just need to take that step. Despite what Tommy Sheridan's inability to figure out how to use Skype, you can still declare your independence. We got to go, finally.
Well, give Max back his castle, Camelot Castle.
That's going to do it for now. Until next time, we'll see you. And if you want to tweet us, just tweet Keiser Report.